The summer of 1976 did not arrive in Great Britain like a season. It arrived like a biblical affliction. For those who lived through it, the memory is still visceral. It is remembered not as weather, but as an ordeal, something hallucinatory, oppressive, almost supernatural. It felt less like a heat wave and more like a judgment, as if nature itself had turned against a nation whose foundations were already quietly decaying. For months on end, the sky over Britain remained motionless. A relentless, blinding blue hung overhead, baking a country built for rain into something unrecognizable. The lush, wet landscapes of Wales and the Pennines reservoirs that had reliably sustained Britain's industrial heartland, for more than a century, were transformed into cracked basins of dust, dried mud, and bleached stone. What had once been symbols of industrial permanence now looked like the ruins of a forgotten civilization. Across suburban London and the sprawling industrial towns of the Midlands, the government was forced to erect standpipes directly in the streets. Families queued in silence with plastic buckets and jerry cans, waiting patiently for their daily ration of water. These were images associated with drought-stricken villages in the Sahel, not with the capital of a G7 nation, not with the victorious power of the Second World War, not with the former center of a global empire. The heat became so extreme that the asphalt on the M1 motorway physically melted beneath the weight of heavy trucks. Deep grooves were carved into the road surface, scars that would remain visible for years afterward, a permanent reminder that even Britain's infrastructure had begun to soften and fail under pressure. Then came the ladybirds. Billions of them, disoriented by the heat and the absence of moisture. They swarmed the countryside and the coastline, biting tourists on the beaches of Brighton and carpeting pavements in a crawling red mass. It was grotesque, surreal, and deeply unsettling. A nation accustomed to order was suddenly confronted with chaos in its most mundane spaces. But the heat wave was only the visible symptom. It was the physical manifestation of a far deeper and more dangerous fever, one that was burning through the United Kingdom from the inside. While the population sweated under unmoving air, the British state itself was evaporating. The money was gone. The credit lines were snapping shut. The empire that had once financed the industrialization of the world, that had underwritten wars against Napoleon and the Kaiser, was now by the cold logic of finance technically insolvent. It was a moment of national vertigo. For the first time in centuries, the British government woke up to the realization that it was no longer master of its own destiny. It was no longer a lender. 'Twas a debtor, a supplicant, a credit risk to be analyzed by anonymous men in suits in Washington and Frankfurt. And when Britain looked across the Atlantic, expecting salvation, assuming that the warm hand of American friendship would pull it back from the edge, found instead a cold, calculating stare. In Washington, a decision had already been made. The United States, guided by a hard-edged Treasury Department, had concluded that the British experiment in democratic socialism had gone too far. If curing what they saw as the British disease required suffocating the British economy, then so be it. This is the unvarnished story of how that decision played out. This is the story of the year Great Britain effectively became a third-world country. The comforting nostalgia of the era must be stripped away. The romantic image of a plucky post-war nation muddling through adversity collapses quickly when confronted with the raw mechanics of the British economy as it actually existed in the mid-1970s. It was not a journalistic insult or a political talking point. It was a diagnosis, one grounded in arithmetic. For 3 decades after the Second World War, Britain had been living inside a dangerous fiction. The country continued to project the outward symbols of a great power. It possessed nuclear weapons. It maintained a blue-water navy capable of operating across the globe. It upheld an enormous diplomatic network, with embassies stretching from Africa to Asia, and it still occupied a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, a relic of imperial victory frozen in international law. But beneath this impressive facade, The economic foundations were quietly rotting. Britain's industrial base, the very machinery that had won the war, had become obsolete. Factories that once symbolized modernity were now museums of inefficiency. Running aging equipment, producing goods that struggled to compete in global markets increasingly dominated by Germany and Japan. Productivity lagged. Investment dried up. Innovation stalled. Management culture was deeply resistant to change, clinging to old hierarchies and outdated practices. At the same time, powerful trade unions, forged in the struggles of the early 20th century, viewed modernization with deep suspicion. Automation and restructuring were seen not as survival strategies, but as existential threats. Nowhere was this dysfunction more visible than in the British car industry. Companies like British Leyland produced vehicles that became international punchlines cars, infamous for mechanical failures, poor build quality, and chronic delays. Assembly lines routinely stood idle, not because of shortages of materials, but because workers were on strike. Production was disrupted so frequently that weeks of output could vanish without warning. Yet even this industrial paralysis was not the true killer. The invisible enemy consuming Britain from within was inflation. By 1975, inflation in the United Kingdom had surged to nearly 27%. This was not merely an economic statistic. It was a social solvent. Money earned in January was worth dramatically less by December. Savings accumulated over a lifetime of disciplined work were effectively incinerated in real time. The middle class watched helplessly as their living standards collapsed. Pensioners saw fixed incomes rendered meaningless. Trade unions, attempting to shield their members from this destruction, demanded wage increases of 30% or more just to keep pace with rising costs. These demands, in turn, pushed prices even higher. Britain was trapped in a classic wage-price spiral, accelerating toward an economic abyss with no visible break. The government responded in the only way it knew how. It printed money to cover rising wages and public spending, feeding the very inflation it claimed to be fighting. The British pound began to behave like a sick currency, losing credibility by the month. It was a Weimar moment not in imagery, but in psychology. Confidence evaporated. The world began to look at Britain not as a stable, developed economy, but as a cautionary tale. And the world was watching closely. In 1976, the enemy destroying Britain was not a foreign army. There were no tanks crossing borders, no bombers in the sky. The real threat was invisible, technical, and understood by only a handful of men inside the Treasury and the Bank of England. Its name was sterling balances. For decades, these balances had been a source of pride. Vast quantities of British pounds were held by foreign governments as part of their national reserves. Former colonies Nigeria, Kuwait, Hong Kong, and the oil-rich states of the Gulf kept billions of pounds parked in London. It was a lingering sign of imperial prestige. Proof that the pound still functioned as a global currency, second only to the US dollar. In the orderly world of the 1950s and 1960s, this arrangement had worked. But in the volatile financial environment of the 1970s, sterling balances had become something far more dangerous. They were a loaded gun. If those foreign holders lost confidence in Britain's ability to manage its economy, they would sell. And if they sold in large numbers, the pound would not gently decline, would collapse. The sheer volume of sterling held abroad meant that confidence, once broken, could not be restored through minor policy adjustments. The trigger was pulled in March 1976. It did not come in the form of a dramatic, geopolitical shock or a public announcement. Instead, it began with a subtle shift in sentiment. The Nigerian government, increasingly frustrated by the steady erosion of the pound's value and deeply skeptical of Britain's economic competence, began to quietly diversify its reserves. Sterling was exchanged for US dollars and German marks. Other reserve holders noticed. In global financial markets, perception spreads faster than facts. Once Nigeria moved, others followed. What began as prudent diversification quickly turned into panic. The herd instinct took over. On the trading floors of New York, Zurich, and Frankfurt, where the so-called gnomes of Zurich operated, the verdict was swift and unanimous. Sell Britain. The pound, once the backbone of global trade, was dumped en masse like toxic waste. Its exchange rate plunged below the psychological barrier of $2, a level that symbolized more than currency weakness. It marked a collapse in belief in Britain's future. Dennis Healey and the Bank of England fought back with the traditional weapons of central banking. Interest rates were raised sharply in an attempt to punish speculators and lure capital back into sterling. The markets barely noticed. Speculators could smell desperation. Then came the fatal mistake. To defend the pound, the Bank of England began burning through its foreign currency reserves. Billions of dollars and vast quantities of gold were thrown into the market as the bank bought up unwanted pounds, trying to prop up the exchange rate by sheer force of will. It was a futile gesture, like attempting to hold back a tsunami with a bucket. By June, the situation had become catastrophic. Reserves were draining at an alarming pace. In a matter of weeks, Britain lost billions of dollars of national wealth. The bleeding was severe, continuous, and unsustainable. Britain was not just losing a currency battle. It was bleeding to death financially. Dennis Healey understood the reality. There were no conventional weapons left. Only one card remained in his hand. The American card. For decades, the so-called special relationship with the United States had been the cornerstone of British foreign policy. It was treated in Whitehall almost as an article of faith. No matter how bad things became, Britain believed that Washington would never allow its closest ally to collapse. A bankrupt United Kingdom, officials argued, would destabilize NATO. It would weaken the Western alliance at the height of the Cold War. It would expose Europe's northern flank to Soviet pressure and embolden communist parties already gaining ground in Italy and France. The strategic consequences, they believed, were simply too dangerous. It was unthinkable that the White House would let London fall. So when Britain's reserves began to vanish and the pound spiraled downward, senior officials reached out to the U.S. Treasury with confidence. They expected a bridge loan, a discreet agreement, a quiet understanding between old partners that would buy time until the crisis passed. Instead, they walked into a trap. In Washington, the Treasury Department was not run by diplomats or sentimentalists. It was controlled by William Simon, a former bond trader with a hard, uncompromising worldview. Simon was a fierce advocate of free markets and a man who regarded Britain's post-war economic model with open contempt. To Simon and to the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Arthur Burns, Britain was not a victim of misfortune. It was an addict. They believed the country was addicted to government spending, addicted to printing money, and addicted to appeasing powerful trade unions. When they looked at subsidized coal mines, nationalized industries, free healthcare, and price controls, they did not see social protection. They saw a system rotting from moral hazard. There is a famous story from the crisis. When a British official attempted to explain the political difficulty of cutting public spending, Simon cut him off. To him, the British request was not merely economic quit, was a moral failing. He later told President Gerald Ford that rescuing Britain without conditions would be like giving whiskey to an alcoholic. It might provide temporary relief, but it would only deepen the addiction. Simon argued that if the United States bailed Britain out now, the same government would return within 6 months asking for more money. The crisis, he insisted, had to be used as leverage. Britain needed discipline, not sympathy. The American administration was divided. At the State Department, Henry Kissinger worried about the geopolitical consequences of humiliating a key ally. He feared that a weakened Britain would damage Western unity and embolden adversaries. But Kissinger did not control the money. William Simon did, and his argument prevailed. The United States would not save Britain. It would discipline Britain. When Healy formally asked for assistance in June 1976, Washington offered a lifeline that was, in reality, a noose. In practice, it was a time bomb. The loan had to be repaid within 6 months. By December 9, 1976, everyone involved understood the truth. Britain would never be able to repay it. Failure was not a risk, was the plan. And when repayment failed, Britain would be forced into the arms of the International Monetary Fund. This was the masterstroke. The IMF was officially an international institution, but its decisions were dominated by American influence. By pushing Britain toward the fund, Washington could impose harsh economic discipline while pretending its hands were tied. The IMF would play the villain. The United States would stand at a distance, claiming neutrality. It was a financial pincer movement, designed not just to stabilize the pound, but to crush Britain's post-war economic model. The temporary calm bought by the American credit began to fade. The markets had only paused, not forgiven. The budget deficit continued to widen. Inflation remained stubbornly high. And inside the British government, a far more dangerous crisis was unfolding. The cabinet descended into open civil war. This was not a routine disagreement over policy details. It was a fundamental clash over the identity of the nation itself, over whether Britain would submit to the discipline of global finance or attempt to defy it. On the left stood Tony Benn. Benn, the Secretary of State for Energy, was charismatic, intellectual, and deeply ideological. He became the standard-bearer of the Labour Party's socialist wing, articulating a vision that rejected the premise of the crisis itself. To Benn, the collapse of the pound was not a natural market reaction. It was a conspiracy and assault by international bankers, aided by a hostile American treasury, determined to dismantle 30 years of social progress. Benn proposed what he called an alternative economic strategy. In reality, it was a siege economy. Britain, he argued, should refuse IMF assistance outright. It should impose strict import controls, defend the pound by decree, nationalize the banks, and use the power of the state to direct investment into industry. The country would turn inward, shield itself from global markets, and rebuild on its own terms. To Benn and his allies, submitting to the IMF meant surrender. It meant the destruction of the welfare state, the betrayal of organized labor, and the abandonment of democratic socialism. They believed the Treasury had exaggerated the crisis to force through a right-wing economic coup. Across the cabinet table sat Denis Healey and Prime Minister James Callaghan. To them, Benn's plan was not heroic, was suicidal. They understood a brutal truth. Britain imported roughly half of its food and nearly all of its raw materials. Any attempt to default, impose capital controls, or block imports would trigger immediate retaliation. Ships would stop arriving. Shelves would empty within weeks. Factories would grind to a halt for lack of parts. Fuel shortages would cascade into power outages. Britain, they argued, would not become independent. It would become isolated. Cabinet meetings turned into battlegrounds. Hours-long sessions dissolved into shouting matches, accusations of betrayal, and clouds of pipe smoke that hung heavy over Downing Street. The atmosphere was described by participants as Shakespearean. Tragic struggle played out behind closed doors while the country drifted steadily toward disaster. By September, the markets had made their verdict clear. Speculators launched a renewed assault on the pound. The currency collapsed again, this time to $1.63. The Bank of England issued a blunt warning to the Chancellor. The reserves were effectively gone. Britain could no longer guarantee payment for essential imports, fuel rationing, and the possibility of widespread unrest. There were genuine fears that the police and even the army might struggle to maintain order if the economy disintegrated. On September 28, Denis Healey was scheduled to fly to Hong Kong for a Commonwealth Finance meeting. He was already in the car on the way to Heathrow when news broke that the pound was in freefall once again. The run had become a stampede. Healey ordered the car to turn around. He knew he could not leave the country. He had to face the cameras. Hours later, visibly exhausted, he stood before the press and announced the unthinkable. Her Majesty's government was formally applying to the International Monetary Fund for a loan of $3.9 billion, the largest request in the IMF's history. The image of that moment seared itself into the national consciousness. A British chancellor, battered and drained, publicly admitting insolvency. The headlines were merciless. Britain is broke. The begging bowl. The IMF was an institution designed to rescue developing nation-states, emerging from colonial rule or collapsing under dictatorship. It was not meant for the victors of the Second World War. It was not meant for the country that had invented modern banking. In the eyes of the global financial elite, Britain had been demoted. It was no longer a great power. It was a distressed asset. If the IMF application was the moment Britain admitted defeat, what followed was something far worse. In November 1976, the IMF mission arrived in London. They did not behave like guests invited to help a friend in distress. They behaved like forensic accountants arriving to dismantle a failing company. The team, led by the stern and methodical Alan Whittam, established itself with an authority that left no doubt about who was now in charge. They demanded access to everything. The deepest files of the British Treasury were opened to foreign scrutiny. Spending projections, borrowing assumptions, reserve figures, nothing was off limits. What the IMF discovered was alarming. Britain's fiscal machinery was not just overstretched. It was archaic. Data collection relied on handwritten ledgers, delayed reporting, and bureaucratic guesswork. The government did not possess a real-time understanding of its own finances. To the IMF auditors, this was unforgivable. Backed by the implicit power of the U.S. Treasury, they demanded immediate and sweeping action. Public spending would be slashed by billions of pounds. Subsidies that kept food, transport, and fuel affordable for the poor would be reduced or eliminated. The government would sell its shares in British Petroleum, one of the crown jewels of state ownership, to raise cash. Most heretical of all, Britain would abandon its post-war commitment to full employment. Unemployment, the IMF insisted, would have to rise. Inflation could only be crushed by discipline, and discipline required pain. This was not a negotiation. It was a conditional surrender. Inside the Labour government, the shock was existential. The party had been built on the promise of protecting working people from the violence of market forces. Now, under foreign pressure, it was being forced to dismantle the very system it had created. Cabinet meetings became exercises in despair. Prime Minister Callaghan presided over marathon sessions, attempting to break the resistance of ministers who believed the IMF's terms would unleash mass poverty and social breakdown. The left-wing faction fought bitterly. They accused the Americans of deliberately attempting to crush the British labor movement, and they were not wrong. Diplomatic cables between the U.S. Embassy in London and Washington reveal a cold, unyielding strategy. President Ford and William Simon instructed the IMF to hold the line. No cuts, no cash. Meanwhile, an obscure but lethal mechanism seized up entirely: the gilt market. Investors stopped buying British government bonds. Without buyers, the government could not roll over its debt. Cash flow dried up. Britain was suddenly days, possibly hours away from being unable to pay nurses, teachers, soldiers, and civil servants. The comparison to the Third World ceased to be rhetorical. It became administrative reality. Civil servants quietly dusted off contingency plans for rationing and emergency imports. There were serious discussions about how to maintain basic order if supply chains failed. The atmosphere in London turned apocalyptic. And yet, while this high-level financial warfare unfolded behind closed doors, the cultural fabric of the country was tearing apart in full view. This was the moment punk was born. The rage, nihilism, and rejection of authority voiced by bands like the Sex Pistols were not abstract rebellions. They were direct responses to a society that appeared bankrupt economically, morally and politically. Torn clothes, safety pins, and the cry of no future mirrored a nation that no longer believed in its institutions. In the end, resistance collapsed. James Callaghan, a pragmatist to the core, looked at the numbers and accepted what many already knew. There was no alternative. The siege economy was a fantasy. Britain needed dollars, not ideology. One by one, ministers capitulated. They agreed to the cuts. They agreed to the asset sales. They agreed to rising unemployment. In December 1976, the Chancellor announced the measures in Parliament. Labour MPs sat in stunned silence, fully aware that they were voting to dismantle the system they had spent their lives constructing. The post-war consensus was dead. The immediate crisis passed. The IMF loan was approved. The pound stabilized. Foreign reserves were replenished. On the surface, Britain survived. But the damage inflicted in 1976 was not financial alone. It was psychological. The humiliation cut deep, far deeper than any recession or balance sheet adjustment. Something fundamental had broken in the national consciousness. The old economic model had lost all credibility. It's the idea that the state could guarantee full employment, rising living standards, and economic security through permanent deficit spending was no longer just questioned, it was publicly buried. In the aftermath of the crisis, a generation of politicians, civil servants, and voters drew the same conclusion. This must never be allowed to happen again. Watching closely was a rising opposition figure with a sharp eye for weakness: Margaret Thatcher. To Thatcher, the events of 1976 were not an unfortunate accident. They were proof of guilt. Proof that socialism had not merely failed, but disgraced the nation. She wielded the IMF humiliation as a weapon, arguing relentlessly that Britain had been reduced to begging because it lacked discipline. Her prescription was uncompromising: hard money, privatization, and the systematic destruction of trade union power. The discipline imposed by the IMF, she argued, should not be resisted, it should be institutionalized. The trauma of 1976 prepared the electorate for radical medicine. When Thatcher came to power in 1979, the country was so scarred by inflation, strikes, and humiliation that it was willing to accept policies once considered unthinkable. The neoliberal revolution that swept through Britain and later the world under Reagan was born not in prosperity, but in panic. But there was one final bitter twist. Years later, economists and historians uncovered an uncomfortable truth. The entire crisis, the panic, the austerity, the political destruction, the surrender of sovereignty had been based, at least in part, on a mistake. The data was wrong. The British Treasury, using antiquated statistical methods to calculate the public sector borrowing requirement, had massively overestimated the size of the deficit. Officials told the IMF that borrowing would exceed £10 billion. Revised figures later suggested it was closer to half that amount. Even more damning, the economy was already beginning to correct itself before the IMF measures took effect. Inflation was easing. The balance of payments was improving. In purely mathematical terms, much of the imposed austerity was unnecessary. The patient had begun to recover. But the doctors insisted on amputation anyway. Whether this error was the result of gross incompetence or a convenient exaggeration that allowed the Bistigster impose its ideological will remains debated. What is beyond dispute is the outcome. The mistake changed history. The crisis of 1976 marked the true end of Britain's post-war era. It ushered in a new world, one in which financial markets held more power than elected governments, and sovereignty existed only so long as creditors allowed it. The phone call that ended the British Empire was not made in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. That was politics. The real end came 20 years later. In the silence of a Treasury office, waiting for a credit check from Washington that almost didn't clear. 1976 stands as a warning. It shows how quickly the veneer of stability can vanish when a currency collapses. It proves that no nation, no matter how historic or proud, is too big to fail. And it reveals the ruthless logic of international finance, where allies can become executioners when the balance sheet no longer adds up. Britain survived, but the country that emerged from that heat wave was harder, more cynical, and permanently haunted by the memory of the year it had to beg. The year the empire finally accepted its new reality: just another nation. Struggling to survive in a world where cash is king and debt is the ultimate chain.